Hey guys, this is Mr. V over here doing a book review today for Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power by John Meacham. This is a biography of one of the founding fathers and third president, Thomas Jefferson. This is a very interesting book because it covers, as I said, Thomas Jefferson, but it's a very interesting book and very well written because the prologue gives a good summary of Thomas Jefferson, and it keeps you interested in it, like gives you a good summary of it. And it's really good because you don't need to know history while going into this book. I think it helps if you know history, but you don't need to know it because he describes what leads up to the American Revolution. You know, things like the Stamp Act, or how there was a stop on imports and exports, and how there were still many people who supported the king. And while it was brief, he still gave you that information. So I think that helps that you don't need to know history. Again, I think it helps that you know it, but you don't need to know. So that always helps, you know, when you get into a book like that. And the American Revolution was about, I don't know, about a fourth, about 25% of the way into the book. And he covers briefly what Jefferson did, like what Jefferson accepted, what he rejected, but it was very brief, and he only talked about very few events. And I'll go more in depth about that a little later into the review, but just be aware of that aspect. One thing, though, that was great about this book was I loved how he wrote about the struggles that the United States went through in the 1780s, because we often forget the amount of struggles that the Americas went through after the Revolutionary War, after they had already won the Revolutionary War. Because at that point, there was no central government, there was no president, each state kind of had their own thing going on, they even had different currencies, and Congress was basically powerless. You know, and we often forget that. And that the central government didn't start until 1789. You know, yes, the American Revolution ended in 1783, but, or the Revolutionary War ended in 1783, but there was no president until 1789. And, you know, we often forget that. I think John Meacham could have written a little more, but it is good, and I'm glad that he wrote about the struggles that the Americas went through during that time. And then, you know, in the book, he does talk about how that Thomas Jefferson was the first Secretary of State, and that he was the Vice President under John Adams. And he's very brief about it, and you know, he doesn't go through any major events during that time, but you know, he does talk about those times. Now, the heart of the book for Thomas Jefferson is when he was the president. You know, Thomas Jefferson was the third president, and Meacham does go in detail about, or he covers different events during his presidency, and he also covers Jefferson's like thought process during that time. You know, some of the decisions he made, like how there was a possibility of going to war with France and Britain, or the territories that were surrounding the U.S. and what was going to happen, and how some of the U.S. ships were getting attacked, and what should the U.S. do, and like Thomas Jefferson had to make that decision. And he goes in detail about the scandals, such as, you know, the removing of former officials for his own benefit, or some of the sexual scandals that went on. You know, we don't think of our founding fathers or some of the first presidents having this happen, but it did happen. Just like current presidents have scandals, former presidents had scandals. Some of the first presidents had scandals too. So, you know, he does talk about that aspects. And he also talks about Jefferson's accomplishments, the biggest one being the Louisiana Purchase, you know, and he does talk about that. And I found like the reasons behind it were very interesting, and it is a lot of fun how he goes in depth about that. And I also liked that he covered after his presidency, as Jefferson still lived for many years after he was president. You know, he still lived for many years, and it was nice hearing about what he did, but also the struggles that he faced. It wasn't just like a smooth sails after his presidency. You know, he still had many struggles. And lastly, the author also describes Jefferson's thought on slavery. Now, slavery was a big thing after Jefferson was done with his presidency, and the presidents that followed until the Civil War in the 1860s. So he goes in depth about what Jefferson thought, and it's very interesting, and I thought the author did a great job of explaining it and putting it in like a good perspective. So, you know, I enjoyed that aspect. Now, some of the things I did not like about this book. One thing was that it was a slower start. You know, he gives you a really good prologue, but then it became a little slower after that, and you have to kind of want to stick with it. So if you start the book, make sure you stick with it. And one of the big things, though, I did not like was that he was very brief about the American Revolution. And Thomas Jefferson was one of the founding fathers. And he was very brief to where he would even like just skip years. And I felt that was not good, because he would go from like 1776, then he would like jump to 1779 and then 1781. And there were so many events, big events, that happened in between those years. And the Americans even almost lost at one point. Yet he didn't cover that, which I felt, you know, he should have covered a lot more, especially because Jefferson was a founding father and he wrote the Declaration of Independence, and Jefferson still did a lot. So, you know, I felt he could have covered more of that aspect. And overall, I feel that throughout the whole book, he actually should have gone in more depth about a lot of things, especially his presidency. He did go in depth about some things, but I feel he could have gone in more depth about his presidency and his life, because a lot happened during Jefferson's life. And you definitely can read about it, but you just kind of get a good overview of Jefferson, and that I think he could have given you a little more about Jefferson's life. Because I've always felt with different authors, I've read many books now on biographies, like you don't need to make it boring, you don't need to make it 2,000 pages, but you just, you know, Jefferson did a lot, and you just don't get the full impact of what he did, because I felt the author was too brief on many of the accomplishments Jefferson did. So I felt that he could have gone in a little greater depth and made it just a little longer, and I think it would have had a better impact overall. And lastly, one of the things I didn't like about the way he wrote the book was I felt he was too easy on Jefferson, in that it was almost like he made it seem like everything that happened, Jefferson had planned, and he was fine with everything. And, you know, he did mention a few disagreements, but he just made it seem like Jefferson never lost his temper, and that he was fine with whatever was going on, and that he had basically like almost planned it all out. I'll just give you one example. There's many in the book, but one example was after Washington was president, you know, there was the second, who was going to be the second president, and John Adams won that, and then Thomas Jefferson was going to be vice president. And he made it seem like Jefferson was fine to be the vice president and did not want to be the second president. He even made it seem like he didn't even want to be the second president. And based off other things I've read, I don't think that was the case. I don't think Jefferson planned on being John Adams vice president. I think Jefferson wanted to be the second president. But that's where I say he was a little too easy on Jefferson in those regards. But, you know, those are just some of the things I didn't like about the book. But overall, you know, I thought his writing style he was very well written, because it was very easy to read, and he had like an enjoyable style when you were reading it, and that's why I made it very easy to absorb it. And one really great thing about it was I thought he had a very nice chapter length, in that the chapters weren't too long. Some of them were a little shorter, but the chapters weren't too long, which I think was great, because it made it very easy to be able to read a chapter or two chapters and be able to put it down. As I don't like when authors make super long chapters, because it's not always easy to finish it if it's super long. So it was always great because I could always finish the chapter. But, you know, overall, I felt the book, it had a good overview of Jefferson's life, but that there were many events were either very brief or overlooked, in my opinion, and that I think he should have gone more in depth with some of the events, because you get, you know, just a good overview of Jefferson's life. But if you are interested in Jefferson, you know, I still think this is a very fun biography to read if you have any interest in him. So I would still recommend that you guys go out and read it. If you guys have any questions or comments or anything like that, please post it in the comment section below. I hope you guys click the subscribe button, as I always upload multiple different types of book reviews. But thank you for watching my book review today. This is Mr. V. Go enjoy reading.